Hello everyone. In today's video I bring you an impactful story full of revelations. Meet Celestine Holloway, a woman who experienced trauma and self-destruction until a near-death experience revealed the shocking truth that only 1% of Christians actually reach the celestial kingdom. This discovery transformed his understanding of faith and true love. So, leave your like, subscribe, and activate the bell so you don't miss anything. Get ready for a story that will make you rethink what it means to live your faith. I grew up in Providence, Rhode Island, a city famous for its historic architecture and cobblestone streets. But for me, the city's beauty was just an ironic frame for a life marked by chaos. My name is Celestine Holloway, and for as long as I can remember, my world has been shrouded in shadow. The bright lights that reflected off the windows at night were nothing more than distant reflections, impossible to reach. My home was a cramped apartment in a worn-out building, where the thin walls echoed with shouts and arguments. My father left home when I was just 8 years old. I remember that night, the door slamming loudly and the terrifying silence that followed, broken only by my mother's soft cry. It was as if he had taken all hope with him. My mother, once a woman with vibrant eyes and an easy smile, got lost in a world of bottles and needles, as if trying to numb his absence. "Celestine, take the money from the jar and go buy me more cigarettes," she once said, her voice drunk and her eyes lost. I, 10 years old and with shaking hands, obeyed without question. Those walks through the dark streets of Providence, amid the distant sounds of sirens and muffled laughter, were the only breaks from the constant tension of our home. Quentin, my younger brother, was my only point of light. In moments when reality became unbearable, I would hug him and whisper, "One day, we'll get out of here, I promise." But even that promise, spoken with the greatest conviction I could muster, seemed fragile. Over time, I became desensitized, my heart hardening with each new episode of violence and despair. School, which was supposed to be a refuge, soon became a reminder of everything I wasn't: safe, happy, normal. The other students seemed to live in a parallel universe, where their worries were limited to exams and school dances. I avoided looks and carried shame in silence. Each day at home was a battle between hope and the inevitability of darkness. My mother sank deeper. The looks of pity from the neighborhood increased, and the promise I made to Quentin seemed further away. However, it was this chaotic childhood that paved the way for the next events in my life, a winding road that I didn't yet know would lead me to rock bottom and, unexpectedly, to redemption. My first contact with drugs happened early, long before I understood the true meaning of addiction. At the age of 13, during a clandestine party at an older neighbor's house, a friend passed me a rolled cigarette that gave off a strong, sweet smell. "Come on, Celestine, relax," she said, laughing. I hesitated for a moment, but then took the first drag, and with it came the fleeting feeling of freedom, something I had never felt at home. Time passed, and what started as a form of escape turned into a relentless necessity. Nights of sporadic parties gave way to daily encounters in dark alleys, where the only thing that mattered was the next dose. By age 19, I had already tried a variety of substances that filled the void inside me, if only for a few moments. It was as if each use pulled me deeper into a hole I dug myself, blind to what I was missing. "Celestine, you're ruining your life. Look at you," Quentin shouted once, his eyes filled with fear and anger. But his words crashed into the wall of self-defense I had built over the years. "You don't understand anything, Quentin. This is the only thing that stops hell, at least for a while," I replied in a shaky voice that I barely recognized as my own. The consequences of my choices began to accumulate. I lost jobs, friends, and ultimately even self-respect. My actions became impulsive and desperate. Once, to get money, I sold the last souvenirs my father had left before he disappeared: a rusty pocket watch and a yellowed letter he had written to my mother. The guilt that consumed me after that day became another layer of my addiction, a cycle of self-destruction that seemed to have no end. What surprised me most was my own disbelief in the possibility of a better tomorrow. Life came down to the now, the moment I put something in my veins to ward off the internal screams. The spiritual world, for me, was an invention of fragile minds. There was no God, there was no soul, just raw, unforgiving reality. Every time I looked in the mirror, I saw a shadow of what could have been: the sunken eyes, the pale skin, the trembling fingers. Everything was a reflection of choices and losses. And that's how I continued until the moment that changed everything. A March night that, in my numb state, I could never have predicted. As the years passed, my disbelief in spirituality deepened. I became a militant nihilist, a person who not only ignored the idea of a superior force, but mocked it. My days were spent in dimly lit bars and rundown apartments, where conversations about nothingness and the absurd were as common as the smell of burning cigarettes. "Do you really believe there is anything beyond this?" I once asked one of my few remaining friends, Max, who used to read books on Eastern philosophy. He looked at me with compassion, and for a moment, I saw that he wanted to convince me otherwise. "Celestine, we are not just flesh and bones. There is something more. You know that," he said, his voice soft. I rolled my eyes and smiled dismissively. "If there's anything else, he's too busy to care about us," I replied, raising my glass in a bitter toast to the void. The nights in Providence were a reflection of my soul, dark, cold, and indifferent. I watched the faith of the people around me like someone watching a distant spectacle, without understanding the reason for the euphoria. For me, believing in something divine was a sign of weakness, a way to escape the harsh reality I faced every day. God, if he existed, had abandoned the world long ago, and my own life was proof of that. A convinced atheist, I never let an opportunity pass by to question or even ridicule anyone who spoke about spirituality. A clear example was when a woman on the street offered me a pamphlet about salvation in Jesus. "Do you think a piece of paper will change my life?" I asked, laughing loudly and snatching the pamphlet from his hands. The woman's eyes, sad and tired, didn't affect me. In that moment, my disbelief was armor against the vulnerability I feared more than anything else. But as much as I tried to deny it, something deep inside me wanted to believe. It was a seed buried beneath layers of pain and cynicism, a vestige that refused to die completely. There were moments, rare and fleeting, when I looked at the starry sky and felt an inexplicable shiver, but then I drowned it in another dose, another escape. The culmination of this disbelief happened just before the night my life changed forever. After a fight with Quentin, who was now away and avoided even responding to my messages, I sat on the edge of the river bridge that crossed the city, with a bottle in my hand and a bitter laugh. "If there is a God, he must be laughing in my face right now," I muttered, looking out into the dark water, and in my mind, that was the end of any faith I might have had. But little did I know that what came next would overturn every single certainty in which I anchored myself. The night that redefined the contours of my life began like any other in Providence, cold, with the sharp wind whizzing through the alleys and deserted streets. My footsteps echoed as I walked to the chaotic apartment I shared with other addicts. The room was filled with smoke and an unsettling silence. A slight buzzing took over my head, the result of a toxic mix of substances I had consumed throughout the day. I sat in a corner of the faded sofa, my skin crawling and my eyes fixed on nothing. The world seemed like a gray blur. With automatic movements, I prepared the dose that, without knowing it, would be the last in my life as I knew it. The needle entered the skin, and within seconds, the world collapsed into a sea of darkness. The silence was replaced by a lightness that bordered on the surreal. I found myself floating above my inert body, as if a curtain had been opened to a scene I never imagined existed. A warm white light filled everything around me, and with it came an indescribable feeling of peace and unconditional love. For the first time, there was no pain, no fear, no doubt, just a wholeness that transcended anything I could understand. Celestine. The voice was not a sound, but a presence that reverberated throughout my being. It didn't come from a visible figure, but I felt I was facing a creative force, something greater than any concept of God that I had ridiculed for years. I felt tears slide down what felt like my face, but I no longer had a body. And then came the revelation that shook me to my core. Only 1% of Christians truly reach the heavenly kingdom. The majority do not practice the teachings of Jesus in a genuine way. They do not experience love for others. The words echoed, penetrating my consciousness and dismantling all the certainties I had built. Why? Was the only question I could ask. The answer came in the form of images that played before me like a movie. I saw myself before I was born, choosing the difficulties and challenges I would face on earth. Every painful moment, every wrong decision was part of a bigger plan. "You are a spiritual soldier," the voice revealed to me. "Their mission is to help raise the consciousness of the planet and show the power of true love. I didn't want to go back. The idea of returning to my miserable life filled me with revulsion. I can't, I insisted. But then, I saw an image that seemed to take place in the future. Myself, sitting in a sunny park, laughing with children running around me. That glimpse gave me a small spark of hope, enough to give in. Suddenly, the warmth of the light was replaced by the biting cold of reality. I opened my eyes with a start, coughing and gasping. I was back in the apartment, alone and shaking, but I knew something inside me had changed forever. The experience I had could not be a product of my mind or the drugs. It was real and carried a message I couldn't ignore. The near-death experience I experienced was not just an isolated event. It was the breaking point that triggered a cascade of revelations and reflections. When I opened my eyes that cold night, still sitting on the apartment's worn-out couch, the first thing I felt was a strange weight. Not physical, but emotional. As if gravity had intensified, grounding me in what I had just witnessed. I tried to get up, but my legs were wobbly, and the world around me was spinning. "What was that?" I mumbled, my voice sounding hoarse and strange. I tried to rationalize what had just happened, searching for some semblance of logic. It was just a hallucination, a drug-induced delirium, I repeated to myself, like a mantra that would help me not go crazy. But the truth was, no matter how much he tried to deny it, something deeper had happened. Over the next few weeks, fragmented visions of the light and presence I felt in that experience continued to emerge at random times. Sometimes, as I walked the streets of Providence, I felt the subtle touch of that indescribable peace that enveloped me during my NDE. It was disturbing, but also a comfort. The words spoken to me, "Only 1% of Christians truly reach the heavenly kingdom," echoed incessantly in my mind. I remembered the discouraged looks of the people I passed on the street, the despair in the eyes of the other addicts with whom I shared dark, cold spaces. That 1% represented something bigger than I could understand. The actions, the choices, the moments when someone helps without expecting anything in return, all of this suddenly seemed to have a much more important meaning. However, the most impactful revelation was realizing that I had planned my life before I was born. Seeing myself choosing challenges, like a player in a video game preparing the difficulties of a new level, left me perplexed. The idea that I had deliberately chosen to live in a home marked by addiction and poverty was almost inconceivable, but at the same time it made sense in a strange way. I wasn't just a victim of circumstances, I was an active participant in a mission that I did not understand until that moment. One night, as I tried to sleep on a torn mattress, a clear image appeared in my mind, a stronger, more determined version of me, helping people like me find their way back. "You are a spiritual soldier," the words of the divine presence reminded me. With that thought, a small flame began to burn inside me, pushing me to break out of that cycle of self-destruction. It was then that I realized that, although I was still in darkness, there was a way out, a new life waiting for me. I was on a mission to live not just for myself, but to show others that even the most lost soul could find redemption. The decision to return to life was not an easy one, even with the revelation I received during my near-death experience. For days, I fought the idea that there was something more to be done, something to live for. The memory of that divine light and the voice that told me that I was a spiritual soldier echoed in my mind. But the resistance to accepting that as truth was immense. I was skeptical by nature, and as impactful as the experience was, part of me still attributed it to an overdose-induced psychotic episode. The world around me seemed to want to keep me in darkness. The streets of Providence remained the same. The smell of cigarettes, alcohol, and despair permeated every corner I knew. My friends, if they could be called that, tried to drag me back into the old routine, but something inside me was different. It was as if I carried a seed of hope that, although small and fragile, wouldn't allow me to dive back into it. "Do you think you're special now?" teased Travis, one of the men who used to supply me with drugs, as I refused a dose he offered. His laugh was full of contempt, but this time it didn't shake me. "No, Travis, I'm just trying something different," I replied, feeling the firmness in my voice for the first time in years. Even with this glimmer of change, internal resistance continued. I wanted to believe that all of this was real, but accepting that meant giving up the cynicism and the shield I had built against the world. Every time I remembered the vision of myself in the future, sitting in a park with children running around, the doubt came back to haunt me. It was just a hallucination. It can't be true, I whispered to myself, as if repetition could drive away the desire to believe. But then something happened that shook my skepticism. One gray afternoon, I felt a sudden need to leave the apartment and walk. Without a specific destination, I ended up stopping at a subway station. There, my eyes fell on a middle-aged man who was sitting, holding a necklace from a 12-step group. He noticed my gaze and smiled. "Are you looking for something?" he asked, his voice gentle and serene. The simple question was like a key, unlocking something I barely knew was locked. "I think so," I replied, hesitating. Gabriel Silvano, as I came to know his name, was the first person to reach out to me with true and disinterested compassion. In that brief meeting, he told me about 12-step group meetings and encouraged me to attend one, scheduled for June 1st, 2019. I wasn't sure why, but I felt like I should go. It was at that moment, with the help of that encounter and the seed that germinated within me, that I accepted that perhaps there was something more than darkness. My resistance to returning to life began to dissolve, and the choice to try the road to recovery became stronger than the fear of failure. The first 12-step group meeting that Gabriel Silvano mentioned marked the beginning of a series of changes that happened faster than I could have imagined. On June 1st, 2019, I hesitantly entered the small room in a Providence community center. The place was filled with plastic chairs, and the smell of weak coffee filled the air. The looks were diverse, some curious, others welcoming, but all reflected the same pain I carried. "Welcome, Celestine," said a middle-aged woman with gray hair tied into a tight bun. She smiled at me, and the heat in her eyes made my throat tighten. It was the first time in years that someone had called me by name so genuinely. The group began to introduce themselves, sharing stories of fall and redemption, and I felt for the first time part of something that went beyond pain and emptiness. It was that night that something inexplicable happened. During the meeting, a familiar sense of peace enveloped me, like an echo of the light I had felt in my NDE. My body relaxed, and for a moment I could almost hear the voice that said to me, "You are a spiritual soldier." When I returned home that night, something inside me changed. It wasn't just the absence of desire for the drug, it was an absence of the gnawing pain that always accompanied it. The following days were a mix of hope and fear. I stayed away from the streets that I once walked with eyes bloodshot with despair, but the challenges didn't stop there. I felt waves of anxiety pulling at me, the cold sweat on my hands, my mind screaming at me to get back to the old routine. However, something miraculous happened. All my drug suppliers disappeared, as if they had evaporated from the city. I couldn't explain this strange coincidence, but I took it as a sign. The real cure, however, came in a night of restless sleep. In a dream, I was transported to a bright room where men wearing white coats surrounded me. They looked like doctors, but there was something ethereal about them, something beyond understanding. "We will heal you," one of them said in a firm voice, and I felt a vibrant energy pass through my body, reaching every cell. I woke up with a shock, my heart racing and sweat running down my face. But the feeling was different. I no longer felt the agony of withdrawal. For the first time in years, my body was at peace. The dream seemed so real that it left me stunned. I told Gabriel the experience at the next meeting, and he listened to me with a serious expression. "Believe what's happening, Celestine. You are here for a greater reason," he said, his words sounding like a confirmation of what the voice in the light had told me. In those first few steps, I realized that my healing journey was not just physical. It was a spiritual transformation that took me on a path I could not have predicted, a path that would finally allow me to accept my mission as a spiritual soldier. The spiritual healing I experienced was not the end, but the beginning of a long and challenging journey. The new reality I found myself in required more than simply avoiding drugs. It called for a deep dive into who I was, who I wanted to become, and how I could fulfill the mission that had been revealed. The journey toward recovery was a mix of small advances and falls that taught me to get back up and try again. At the second 12-step group meeting, Gabriel was waiting for me with the same welcoming smile. "Ready to share your story, Celestine?" The question seemed like a challenge, but there was something about it that encouraged me to try. I stood up, knees shaking, and looked at these people who, like me, were seeking some kind of redemption. I don't know where to start. I spent years believing there was nothing but pain and darkness, but something changed in me, and I can't explain it, but I think I'm here for a reason, I confessed, my voice wavering. The looks I received were not of judgment, but of understanding. That room, with its simple chairs and peeling walls, became my sanctuary. With each meeting, I felt stronger, more connected to that light I had experienced during the NDE. With each story I heard, I understood that my suffering was not unique, and this gave me strength to move forward. One day, while walking the streets of Providence, I felt an urge to get to the subway station again. I wasn't sure why, but I let my feet guide me. There, I sat on a bench and watched people pass by. A young woman with a baby in her arms was struggling to balance shopping bags, and without thinking, I got up to help. "Thank you," she said, surprised and relieved. The small action made me feel something I hadn't felt in years: purpose. It was at this time that I met Ruth Carrington, a woman with a severe appearance but with eyes that conveyed a rare kindness. "I'm the director of a rehabilitation center in Brooklyn. We have room for one more person if you want to commit," she told me after one meeting. The invitation felt like a test, an opportunity to deepen my journey. Without hesitation, I accepted. At the rehabilitation center, the first few days were difficult. The rigid routine and lack of technological distractions forced me to face myself in a raw way. During the nights, I voraciously read texts that Ruth made available, writings on spirituality, biblical studies, and even books on metaphysics. It was there that I began to understand what my NDE voice meant by spiritual soldier. I was a co-creator of my reality and had the choice to change the course of my story. Gabriel continued to visit me occasionally, offering words of encouragement and reminding me of the importance of my path. "Remember, Celestine, every little victory counts, and you are here because you have something to teach and learn," he said. These words were a constant reminder that my mission was not mine alone. It was something that needed to be shared with others, so that they too could find hope and light in their own struggles. The first few months at the rehab center in Brooklyn were like being reborn, but without the comfort that word usually brings. The routine was severe, and the absence of any type of technology or external communication made the days seem longer and more intense. However, it was this deprivation that forced me to look inside myself in a way I had never done before. Every morning began with meditation sessions guided by Ruth Carrington. His firm but welcoming voice echoed through the Spartan room where we sat in circles. "Close your eyes and seek the light within you. It was always there, waiting to be found," she said, and I felt a familiarity in that instruction. The light she mentioned was the same one that had enveloped me during the NDE, and now, with my eyes closed and my heart open, I tried to connect with it again. The days were divided between self-knowledge and study activities. Ruth, with her peculiar mix of sternness and empathy, constantly challenged me. "Celestine, I want you to read this," she said one afternoon, handing me an old book with a worn cover titled The Pilgrim's Path. The words, initially strange and distant, began to make sense as I read. They talked about spiritual journeys, about the search for the divine in the midst of chaos, and, somehow, it was as if each sentence had been written for me. "You know why you're here, don't you?" Ruth asked one night as we reviewed our notes. The weight of the question hit me hard, but this time, I didn't hesitate. "Yes, I'm here because I chose to be, before I was even born," I responded, echoing the NDE revelation. Ruth just nodded, as if she already knew. My process of spiritual development was not just meditation and reading. There were moments of anguish, when my body yearned for an escape, for a return to the addiction that promised instant relief. At these times, Gabriel, who was now a constant visitor and a kind of mentor, would come to see me. "Don't forget, Celestine, the power is in every choice. You are the creator of your new reality," he said, and these words became my mantra. I spent 17 months in this process of self-discovery. I read everything from sacred texts in the Bible to treatises on metaphysics and attraction, absorbing the knowledge with a thirst I didn't know I had. Little by little, the anger and feeling of being a victim of circumstances were replaced by a new understanding. I was responsible for my path. I began to see my life as a story I wrote myself, with all the choices, past and present, as chapters that brought me here. Over time, the stories of other residents also began to have a profound impact on me. Each story of overcoming, each small triumph, showed me that we were not alone, and I, in some way, was beginning to be a guide for those who arrived as lost as I had been. "Remember, we are all here to support each other and grow together," I said during meetings. echoing Ruth and Gabriel's words. The transformation I experienced at the rehab center wasn't just physical, it was a spiritual and mental metamorphosis. I learned that being a spiritual soldier didn't just mean overcoming my own struggles, but helping others find the light in their own battles. I left that place not only clean but renewed, ready to start living with purpose and dedication to my mission. When I left the rehab center in Brooklyn after 17 months, I felt like the world had expanded before me, but in a way I had never noticed before. I returned to Providence, the city that previously represented only pain and darkness, with a new outlook and a mission pulsing in my chest. The Celestine who walked those streets now carried not only the memory of suffering, but the promise of transformation that I knew I could also bring to others. My first decision was to volunteer at a community center that helped people in vulnerable situations. It was a modest building, with yellowed walls and worn furniture, but full of stories of struggle and hope. The director, a woman with a warm smile named Joanne Matthews, greeted me with a hug. "We need more people like you with that fire in their eyes," she said. Little did she know that that flame was the result of battles that had almost consumed me. My work there was varied. I distributed food, organized support groups, and, sometimes, simply listened to the stories of those who needed a shoulder to lean on. There were days when the pain and despair I saw in others hit me like a blow, but it was also in those moments that I felt the presence of the light that had accompanied me through the NDE. It was as if, with each act of kindness, I reaffirmed the mission given to me. One day, during one of the meetings I organized, a young man named Marcus, who resembled me from years ago, stood up. "I don't believe in God. I don't believe in anything. How can I find hope in something I don't see?" he asked, his voice thick with frustration. I smiled, remembering all the times I asked the same question. I didn't believe it either, but sometimes, it is in the midst of the greatest darkness that we find the light that has always been there, waiting for us, I replied. And the silence that followed was like an echo of that truth that had been revealed to me. Little by little, stories of overcoming began to accumulate. People who attended the center, previously trapped in cycles of pain, began to find small reasons to continue. I shared my story with anyone who was willing to listen, without flourishes or exaggerations. "You know where I've been, what my life was like. If I can find a way, so can any of you," he said with conviction. With each person I helped, I felt that my mission as a spiritual soldier grew stronger. I understood that my role was not just to overcome my own past, but to be a bridge for those who were still in darkness. Gabriel Coe, who became a mentor and friend, often visited me and offered words of encouragement. "Celestine, you are exactly where you need to be," he said, and I knew he was right. The impact I made at the community center spilled over into other areas of my life. I began to be invited to share my story in schools and other recovery centers, spreading the message that true transformation is possible. My name, which was once associated with a past of addiction and pain, now carried a meaning of hope and resilience. Today, I look back and see that every moment of suffering, every wrong decision, and every tear shed paved the way for the life I lead now. The promise I made to myself, to live with purpose and elevate the consciousness around me, was not just a distant memory of my NDE, but the foundation of every day I live. My work at the community center, my mission to help and inspire others, is the greatest proof that even the most lost soul can find redemption and a greater purpose. If you liked this beautiful spiritual testimony, leave a like, comment on your impressions, subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to activate the notification bell to watch each new video and help us spread this message to a greater number of people. Until next time.